On the morning of February 21, 1994, President's Day, Aldrich Ames left his Arlington, Virginia home and made his way to CIA headquarters in nearby Langley. He normally wouldn't head to the office on a holiday, but he was told to come in because there was urgent intelligence to discuss before his scheduled trip to Moscow. He turned right out of his driveway and right again onto the next street. That's when he realized something was off. The car ahead of him stopped at a stop sign, didn't move. The car beside him, waiting to turn left, stayed put. Suddenly, 2 cars behind him boxed in his Jaguar, and then armed FBI agents surrounded him. The plan was to arrest him away from his home so he couldn't destroy evidence of his 9 years of spying for the Soviets and the Russians, in return for $2.7 million in cash, with a promise of more to come. While sitting in the back of the police car, he heard over the radio, "We've secured the house." Journalist and author David Wise, who chronicled Ames' story in his book Night Mover, described how he muttered 2 words: "Oh fuck." Aldrich Ames was the most devastating mole in the history of the CIA. While the CIA determined that Ames began spying in 1985, the seeds of his betrayal had been planted years earlier when he was stationed in Mexico City in 1981. His mission was to recruit Soviet intelligence officers to work for the CIA. His primary target, Igor Shurigin, the KGB's chief of counterintelligence in Mexico. But instead of trying to turn his Soviet counterpart, Ames found a buddy. Like his father, Ames struggled with alcoholism, and he and Shurigin would often engage in marathon drinking sessions, some lasting as long as 17 hours. Over 2 years of wining and dining in Mexico, his cynicism about the Cold War grew. According to his close friend David Sampson, Ames didn't see the Soviets as a real threat.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
He dismissed President Reagan's rhetoric about fighting the evil empire as exaggerated paranoia, convinced that the Soviets wouldn't start a war unless pushed by American aggression. As he grew disillusioned with Cold War politics, his own life unraveled. He was going through a bitter divorce, further fueling his binges. His drinking got so bad that once, when a police officer pulled him over in Mexico City, he was too drunk to answer even the simplest of questions. The only silver lining was Rosario, a Colombian cultural attaché at her country's embassy who came from a politically well-connected family, and they began dating. Despite his negative performance reviews in Mexico City and the belief from his superiors that he was lazy, he kept failing upward. When he returned to headquarters 2 years later, he was promoted to head the Soviet branch of the counterintelligence group, where he oversaw CIA operations against the KGB outside the Soviet Union. His new boss, Rod Carlson, was never told of his employees' alcoholism or his poor performance in Mexico because of the CIA's culture of extreme secrecy. Information was strictly shared on a need-to-know basis, and Carlson apparently didn't need to know. Ames now had access to top-secret information on Soviet agents who were secretly working for the CIA, double agents like Valery Martynov. Martynov arrived in Washington in November 1980, officially a third secretary at the Soviet embassy, but in reality, a KGB officer gathering scientific and technical intelligence. The CIA recruited him in 1982 after meeting him at technical meetings. Martynov was not seduced by money, but by the thrill of espionage. One intelligence officer told author David Wise, "It was the excitement." Martynov was intrigued by the game. He did not think spying for the Americans was wrong because he did not regard us as an enemy. Martynov provided the CIA with Xeroxed documents exposing KGB operations in America, the identities of Soviet intelligence operators on temporary assignment in the US, and the scientific and technical secrets he was ordered to obtain. Like Martynov, Sergei Motorin was officially a third secretary at the Soviet embassy in Washington, but he was also a KGB officer. Motorin's motivations were less about ideology and more about desperation. The FBI blackmailed him after catching him cheating on his wife with a prostitute. He had also been abusing his diplomatic privileges, trading the vodka and Cuban cigars meant for recruiting Americans for stereo equipment for himself. Motorin became a major asset, revealing the names of every KGB officer at the Soviet embassy in Washington. One of the most important Soviet double agents was Dmitry Polyakov, a colonel in the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency. Polyakov was stationed at the United Nations in New York under diplomatic cover and secretly worked for the US for over 2 decades. He identified Soviet agents who had infiltrated the US military. He supplied the CIA with chemical formulas used for secret writing, allowing them to decode intercepted messages. He provided intelligence on Soviet missile systems, nuclear strategy, advanced weaponry, and biological warfare. While stationed in New Delhi, Polyakov met a CIA handler who posed as a fisherman and secretly recorded their conversations. When he was stationed in Moscow, he signaled his CIA handlers using a burst transmitter, a device that in just 2.6 seconds could send an encrypted signal to the US Embassy as he passed by on a streetcar. The CIA also gave him a modified clock that would light up when it received a radio signal indicating that the agency had successfully retrieved an item he had dropped off at a secret location. He didn't spy for money. The only payments he ever received were small gifts worth a few $100s. It was never about money, it was about freedom. He despised the Soviet communist system and saw it as corrupt. Aldrich Ames knew all of their identities as head of the Soviet division of the counterintelligence group, and he delivered their names straight to the KGB. Although he was stuck behind a desk at CIA headquarters, he requested overtime work in the field, claiming he was trying to recruit Soviet contacts as CIA assets. And amazingly, his boss approved that request. So Aldrich Ames, the man who knew the identity of every single Soviet double agent, was now given direct face-to-face contact with Soviet officials. When later asked why he decided to spy, he blamed it on financial pressure, saying, "I felt embarrassed and potentially humiliated to be in a situation in which I had sort of lost control of the household budget, and getting from one paycheck to the next was getting increasingly difficult." Among his debts, furniture for his new apartment with Rosario. The betrayal began in April 1985. He walked into the Soviet embassy, approached a guard, and asked for his letter to be delivered to the KGB chief in Washington. In it, Ames introduced himself and listed a few Soviets who had secretly volunteered their services to the CIA. He asked for $50,000 in return. The following month, in May 1985, Ames met for lunch with KGB agent Sergei Truvakin, officially the first secretary of the Soviet embassy, supposedly to turn him. Truvakin handed Ames $50,000 in cash as he requested, which was more than enough to cover his debts. And yet, Ames couldn't stop himself from wanting more. When later asked why he kept spying, he explained, "I'm still puzzled as to what took me to the next steps. The fear that I had crossed a line which I had not clearly considered before. It was a very rational, clever plan. It was as if I were sleepwalking. But certainly underlying it was a conviction that there was as much money as I could ever use." In June 1985, Ames walked out of Langley carrying plastic bags filled with classified documents. He met Truvakin for lunch at a popular DC restaurant and handed over the agency's most sensitive secrets, including the names of double agents Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin. Aldrich Ames knew he was condemning them to death, as he later admitted when questioned by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. "When you gave these names, Mr. Ames, did you have any realization of the significance of what you were doing, as to the danger that these people would be in?" "Yes, I did." "Did you just rationalize that this was not—" "I did not agonize over it." "Did it occur to you that they might be killed?" "Yes, it did." He wanted to ensure they couldn't expose him. So when he was assigned to debrief Viktor Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer who had defected, he was terrified Yurchenko might recognize him as a traitor, but to his relief, Yurchenko did not. Yurchenko did identify two other American intelligence officers who had been spying for the KGB, NSA analyst Ronald Pelton and CIA agent Edward Lee Howard. He also told the CIA about a secret lab in Moscow where scientists developed poisons, including the kind that killed Bulgarian journalist Georgy Markov, a critic of Bulgaria's communist regime. Markov was walking across London's Waterloo Bridge when he was stabbed in the leg with an umbrella and died 4 days later. The umbrella contained a tiny pellet of the chemical poison ricin. Strangely, after 3 months of working with the CIA, Yurchenko apparently changed his mind about defecting and got on a plane to Moscow, leaving his true loyalties in question. The KGB ordered Martinov to accompany Yurchenko home, even though his job was to gather scientific and technical intelligence. When Martinov returned, he faced arrest and then a firing squad. Although Ames's work at headquarters was once again not spectacular, he kept getting promoted. In the summer of 1986, Ames took up a prestigious post in Rome, but before departing, he had to take a polygraph test, mandatory for CIA officers headed overseas. The KGB advised him to get a full night's sleep, stay calm, and build rapport with the examiner. When asked if he had ever been approached by a foreign intelligence service, Ames deflected, saying he worried he might be targeted in Rome. That answer was apparently good enough for the examiner, who deemed him truthful. Years later, when the FBI reanalyzed his polygraph, they found clear signs of deception regarding unauthorized disclosures of classified information. Once in Rome, he openly met with his new Soviet intermediary, Alexei Krenkov, pretending he was trying to recruit him as a CIA source. In reality, he was handing over top-secret documents in exchange for $20,000 to $50,000 in cash each time. Even without direct access to Washington's most sensitive secrets, he still managed to steal highly classified documents, including the identities of CIA agents operating in Eastern Europe. Ames walked right out the front door of the embassy with shopping bags full of classified material. By his own estimate, he passed along 1,000 documents a year, so many that the KGB urged him to slow down as their small team in Moscow struggled to process everything. With his Soviet cash, Ames indulged in every luxury Rome had to offer: expensive suits, fine dining, and long, boozy lunches that left him too drunk to work in the afternoon. He once drank so much at an embassy reception, he passed out in the street. If any of his colleagues wondered how he could afford his lifestyle, Ames shrugged it off. His wife, Rosario, came from a well-connected family in Colombia, after all. To hide his growing wealth, Ames opened Swiss bank accounts, including one in his mother-in-law's name, with himself as a trustee, taking advantage of Switzerland's strict banking secrecy laws. By the time Ames and Rosario left Rome to return to Washington 3 years later, they were a family of 3, having welcomed a son they named Paul. Meanwhile, the CIA was growing increasingly alarmed. Its network of Soviet informants suddenly began to disappear. Something was very wrong. The CIA didn't believe, or didn't want to believe, there was a traitor within their ranks. The KGB added to the confusion, openly spreading the theory that Edward Lee Howard was behind the leaks to divert attention away from the real mole, Aldrich Ames. To get to the bottom of it, Jean Wertefeuille was assigned to lead a small team to investigate whether a mole existed. Wertefeuille began her career at the CIA as a typist and rose to become a leading expert on Soviet espionage. She had no children or partner. The CIA was her life, and she was devoted to her work. She was analytical, patient, and observant, the perfect person to sift through troves of data in search of a spy. By 1986, she had formed a small team of mole hunters, though its members changed over time. For the first 2 years, the team focused on potential communications breaches before seriously considering the possibility of a mole. But that changed when Ames' spending became too extravagant to ignore. Upon returning from Rome, he paid $540,000 in cash for a 5-bedroom house in Arlington, Virginia. To cover his tracks, he withdrew the money from the Swiss bank account registered in his mother-in-law's name, disguising it as a family gift to avoid paying taxes. He also bought a brand new Jaguar. A CIA employee grew suspicious and sounded the alarm. Soon after, Dan Payne, a member of the mole hunting team, sent a memo to the CIA's Office of Security requesting an investigation into Ames' finances. He flagged Ames' lavish spending habits over the last 5 years and emphasized there is a degree of urgency involved in our request. Yet the CIA failed to act with urgency. The agency was preoccupied with the Iran-Contra affair, a major political scandal. So Ames was not a priority, and he continued funneling information to the Soviets. He landed at the Counterintelligence Center and then led the Soviet division of the KGB working group to analyze Soviet intelligence activities, while ironically feeding them classified information. The KGB suggested a safer method of communication. Instead of meeting up to hand-deliver documents, they switched to dead drops, prearranged locations where he could leave classified materials without ever meeting his handlers. To signal a dead drop, Ames would mark a specific mailbox with chalk, directing the KGB to retrieve the package from another location, such as a pedestrian footbridge in Bethesda, Maryland. For his payments, the KGB would leave cash at a separate site, including a drain pipe in Wheaton Regional Park in Maryland. By December 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, Ames worried his payments would stop. But to his relief, nothing changed. The KGB simply rebranded itself as the SVR. That same year, the CIA finally took the mole hunt seriously, partnering with the FBI, which was responsible for counterintelligence operations on U.S. soil. When investigators secretly examined Ames' finances, they say he had deposited hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash into his bank accounts, far beyond what his $69,000 CIA salary could explain. The CIA reassigned Ames to the Counter-Narcotics Center to deliberately keep him away from Soviet intelligence operations. The mole hunting team watched closely as he took another polygraph in 1992, a routine procedure conducted every 5 years. Yet, in an incredible blunder, the polygraph examiners weren't informed about the suspicion surrounding his wealth and never questioned him about its source. When asked if he was working for a foreign intelligence service, he showed no signs of deception. But when questioned about his contacts with foreign nationals, the results indicated deception. Ames quickly deflected, explaining he'd been in contact with his Colombian mother-in-law who had given him money. The polygraph examiners accepted his explanation without pressing further, and once again, he passed the test when he shouldn't have. And once again, the investigation stalled. But this time, the mole hunting team refused to back down. Paul Redman, a legendary CIA spy, pushed for renewed urgency, convinced that Ames was a traitor. He had never liked Ames and considered him to be lazy, arrogant, and incompetent. In 1992, Jean turned 60, and under CIA policy, she was required to retire. But she wasn't ready to walk away, not while the mole remained at large. So she returned on contract, determined to see the case through. And it's a good thing she did, because the breakthrough was just around the corner. In August 1992, CIA officer Sandy Grimes made a game-changing discovery. While reviewing Ames' bank records, she noticed a pattern. His large cash deposits always coincided with meetings with a Soviet official, Sergei Truvakin, the KGB officer Ames had frequently lunched with, and the first one he passed secrets to in exchange for cash. This was the aha moment they were looking for. The FBI then searched Ames' office at the Counter-Narcotics Center and found something alarming: top-secret documents related to Soviet anti-submarine warfare, a topic completely unrelated to drug enforcement. Ames still had no idea that he was under investigation. He sent a message to the SVR reassuring them, "All is well with me. I have no indication that anything is wrong or suspected." Determined to gather more evidence, the FBI launched a surveillance operation, tracking Ames through agents disguised as joggers, a young couple, a mother with her baby stroller, street workers, even grandmothers. They also searched his trash while he was away on an official work trip. FBI agent Les Weiser had been ordered not to do it, with his boss deeming it too risky, but he ignored the directive and did it anyway. And it's a good thing he did, because agents found a draft Post-it note in the trash that confirmed Ames was ready to meet the SVR in Bogota, Colombia on October 1st. He wrote that he wouldn't be able to read their signal at the designated site for a week in September because he'd be out of town. If they couldn't meet in Bogota, he asked them to leave a message in the drain pipe at the dead drop location. The FBI escalated its surveillance. They wiretapped his home phone and planted hidden microphones inside his house, capturing conversations between him and his wife, Rosario, about his meetings with the Russians. She was overheard saying about a mission, "Well, honey, I hope you didn't screw up." They accessed his computer hard drive, uncovering a list of his signal sites and dead drop locations. The FBI watched Ames leave this chalk mark on a mailbox in Washington, D.C.'s Georgetown neighborhood, a signal to the SVR that he was ready for a meeting in Bogota. Moscow preferred to meet spies outside the U.S. The FBI knew it had to act quickly, as the CIA had scheduled Ames for a trip to Moscow in February 1994. Canceling it now would have looked too suspicious, but they couldn't risk letting him go. He could defect, just like Edward Lee Howard, and the FBI might lose their chance to catch him forever. Moscow had promised Ames land on a riverbank in Russia where he could build his dream home one day. The day before his scheduled flight, on February 21, President's Day, Ames was called into the office under the pretense that the CIA had urgent intelligence to share before his trip. When Ames pulled out of his driveway and turned the corner, the FBI boxed him in and arrested him. They brought him into an interrogation room with walls covered with pictures of his dead drop sites and locations where he had been stationed. FBI agent John Lewis described Ames' reaction to author David Wise. He looked like the wind was knocked out of him. He was asked to sit down. When he looked around at the walls, his head sank, and he couldn't look up.
It is a very serious case. I congratulate the FBI and the CIA for the work they did in cracking it. We will be immediately lodging a protest to the Russian government.
He betrayed at least 14 Soviet agents who were secretly working for the CIA, 10 of whom were executed. Among them was Dmitry Polyakov, who had returned to Moscow in 1980 looking forward to retirement. 8 years later, the Soviet Union executed him. His loss deeply affected the CIA, especially because his actions weren't motivated by money. He had turned against communism. Author David Wise described how, when Jean Veltfoy spoke of the Soviet general, tears welled in her eyes. She said, "It was a bad day for us when we lost him." During Ames's debriefing with Jean, he admitted that when he realized the KGB was rounding up double agents at an alarming rate, he tried to convince the Soviets to deflect suspicion onto her. Jean later recalled, "At first I wanted to jump across the table and strangle him, but then I started laughing. It was really funny because he was the one in shackles, not me." Aldrich Ames pled guilty to espionage charges. Before his sentencing, he addressed the court. "I bitterly regret the catastrophe which my betrayal of trust has brought upon my wife and son, and upon any who have loved and cared for me. No punishment by this court can balance or ease the profound shame and guilt which I bear. For those persons in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere who may have suffered from my actions, I have the deepest sympathy, even empathy. We made similar choices and suffer similar consequences." Except they didn't suffer similar consequences because Aldrich Ames never received a bullet to the head. Despite having one of the best defense attorneys in the country, Ames knew there was no escaping a life sentence. His priority was minimizing Rosario's punishment for the sake of their young son. Rosario painted herself as a victim, telling the media she hated her husband and that he had manipulated her. She claimed she had only discovered his spying late in the game when she found a wallet containing a mysterious note about a meeting in Colombia. As for all of that money that suddenly came rolling in, she said Ames explained away their sudden wealth by claiming it came from an old college friend from his Chicago days, Robert, a supposed investor whose money Ames managed in exchange for a commission. But both Rosario and Aldrich Ames failed polygraph tests about when she truly learned he was a spy. Rosario Ames was sentenced to just over 5 years in prison and served 4.5 years with good behavior. Aldrich Ames was sentenced to life without parole and is currently serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institute in Terre Haute, Indiana. Did you notice that some of the footage in this video was created using AI? Not a lot, but some. AI is changing everything and it's only getting better. But there are two big problems. AI isn't always free from censorship. For example, I recently asked ChatGPT to create an image of North Korean soldiers fighting in Ukraine, but it refused to generate that image, explaining it would depict a politically sensitive and potentially misleading scenario. Besides censorship, the other big issue is AI isn't always private. ChatGPT put the former director of the NSA on its board. Edward Snowden called it a willful, calculated betrayal of the rights of every person on Earth. If you want an uncensored, private alternative, I highly recommend Venice AI. Venice AI is a fully private, permissionless generative AI platform. No tracking, no censorship, no stored conversations. Unlike other AI platforms, Venice AI doesn't store your chats on its servers. Your conversations stay completely private, saved only on your own device. I love how intuitive and clean the interface is. It's fast, easy to use, and free to try. You don't even need to create an account. Just click my link venice.ai/newsthink and start chatting. That's venice.ai/newsthink to start chatting today. My custom link is in the description. And if you want full access to an uncensored private AI experience, you can use my code Newsthink to get 20% off a Pro plan. With the Venice Pro plan, you unlock a ton of upgraded features, including unlimited text prompts, stunning high-resolution images, an incredibly high daily limit for image generation, plus access to the newest and most intelligent models. Try it out and see the difference. Thanks for watching. For Newsthink, I'm Cindy Pom.